Hi, welcome to International Christian Fellowship of Lublin. We're continuing our look at the book of Ephesians, and we've come to the section where Paul has instructions for different spheres of relationships, all based on the command from chapter 5, verse 21 of mutual submission to one another. And so now we've come to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, and instructions for specifically for fathers, and I think we can broaden that to say instructions for parents. So let me read that verse, Ephesians 6, verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger by the way you treat them. Rather, bring them up with the discipline and instruction that comes from the Lord. So this time we're looking at instructions for parents, specifically fathers. Now, although fathers are pointed out, and there may be a special need for these instructions for them, I think in the context of this whole passage, we can safely say that the principle applies to both parents. So the radical part of the teaching in Paul's teaching here in this section lies in the mutual respect between parents and children. Of course, Paul is initially speaking to a world quite different from ours. In his world, the power of parents, especially fathers, um, played out by throwing female babies away, by drowning sickly or deformed children. This was a world where children were property, where they could be bought, sold, used, abused, or killed at the whim of a father. So this was a unbridled power for the father in Paul's world. Now, of course, some things in our world remain unchanged. Unwanted babies are still aborted way too often. Handicapped children are still abandoned way too often, or sometimes as well aborted. And in many places, children are still slaves. They are still abused. They are still they still die needlessly. As Christians, we should we should want to do everything in our power to change those problems in our society, to protect children, born and unborn, and make it possible for them to live lives that are free from abuse and slavery. Now, in verse 4, we see that the child parent relationship is not one sided. So we see that in all these spheres, in the household, the stronger have an obligation to the weaker. The gospel introduced a fresh element into parental responsibility by insisting that the feelings of the child must be taken into consideration. In a society where the father's authority was absolute, the Latin word was pater potentatis. This represented a revolutionary concept. Paul introduces a revolutionary value of all people, even the most powerless. In Colossians 3:21, the parallel passage to this one, he explains why fathers should not provoke their children to anger in case they become discouraged. So, Paul speaks to fathers as the head of the household, but the term can be translated generally as parents. So, what are we to do or not to do? And Paul says, do not exasperate your children, do not provoke them to anger. He uses a term that refers to goading someone into a state of perpetual resentment. Fathers must not make unreasonable demands. Otherwise, children, being overcorrected, may lose heart. Continuous criticism and rebuke, discipline that diminishes instead of encourages, breaks the spirit of a person. Now, discipline is essential, but it needs the context of reciprocal respect. We will look in a minute at a more specific application, but the basic principle is this: do not goad your children into a state of resentment. What are we to do? We are to bring them up in nurture and admonition. There are three important words here that are translated in different ways. The first is the main verb, to bring them up, to rear them. This verb was also used in chapter 5, verse 29, when Paul talked about caring for your own body. The word in Greek also can carry a meaning associated with education. But we see the root idea. Raising your children inherently involves a tender, nurturing care, not necessarily, of course, an easy task for many fathers. Then, however, this main verb is modified by two verbs that have a stricter, firmer meaning. The first, training, means strict discipline, not in the sense of punishment, but in a sense of sport, of that kind of training, that kind of discipline. An admonition, as it is in the English Standard Version, usually can carry a connotation of punishment, but has a wider meaning of instruction, or specifically correction through instruction. So, this kind of reproof is part of the parental task, but it's an element of instruction. So, putting it all together, we need to avoid producing long-term exasperation in our children. We need to rear them in tenderness, but not avoiding those times when they need correction and discipline. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Of course, I would be the first to admit that it is not easy and that I have erred in this area more times than I can count. What else, though, does the Bible say about raising children? Well, back in the law, in the book of Deuteronomy, we twice have some instructions connected with the Shema, the Jewish affirmation of one God, and how parents were supposed to repeat this instruction to their children. So that we see this in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 7, and then again in Deuteronomy 11:19. But in 6, 7, it says, repeat them again and again to your children. Talk about them when you are at home and when you are on the road, when you are going to bed and when you are getting up. Then in Psalm 127, verse 3, children are a gift from the Lord. They are a reward from him. And then, of course, just as we saw with instructions for children, there are many places in the book of Proverbs that talk about the responsibility of parents toward children or how they are supposed to raise them. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24. Those who spare the rod of discipline hate their children. Those who love their children care enough to discipline them. Then Proverbs chapter 19, verse 18. Discipline your children while there is hope, otherwise you will ruin their lives. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 6, probably one of the most famous verses when it comes to raising your children. Direct your children onto the right path, and when they are older, they will not leave it. And then a few verses later, verse 15, a youngster's heart is filled with foolishness, but physical discipline will drive it far away. A chapter later in chapter 23, verses 13 and 14. Don't fail to discipline your children. The rod of punishment won't kill them. Physical discipline may well save them from death. And then chapter 29, verses 15 and 17. To discipline a child produces wisdom, but a mother is disgraced by an undisciplined child. Discipline your children, and they will give you peace of mind and will make your heart glad. Then we jump forward to the New Testament, first in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, the end of verse 14. After all, children don't provide for their parents, rather parents provide for their children. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 8. But those who won't care for their relatives, especially those in their own household, have denied the true faith. Such people are worse than unbelievers. So the Old Testament passages strongly emphasize the need for discipline. The rod is repeated several times in those passages. A legitimate question would be, Whether Paul is changing the focus, as he does also in 2 Corinthians and in 1 Timothy, in light of the gospel and the mutual respect that he's encouraging within the church. However, I don't think that Paul is changing the need for correction and discipline. He is, however, emphasizing the need for that we fathers, when we administer discipline and bring correction, to do it in a way that helps the child grow and does not lead to bitterness or resentment. So, how do we apply these words? And this is the rub, right? On the one hand, sometimes we men struggle with anger and we go too far in disciplining our kids. Sometimes we go the other way. We allow our children too much leeway and they do whatever they want, becoming little hellions. Stress-free child rearing is not really stress-free. Even more complicated, every single child is different. Some just need a stern look and they melt. We had one child like that. Some have very strong wills and never submit, at least not on the inside. We also had a child like that who said, I'm sitting down on the inside, but I'm standing up on the I'm sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. And the answer is not to break those strong, and the answer is not to break those strong wills into submission, as some Christian teachers say. So my application by nature is a little general. Avoid constant criticism, avoid only using physical punishment, avoid discouraging words. Now, is physical punishment allowed? Well, according to the Bible, it certainly is. Are you sinning if you physically discipline your child? No. Are you sinning if you don't physically discipline your child? Well, maybe. But again, it depends on the child, what they need. It, we need we need to remember to encourage our children to be involved in their lives, and actually right here is something that many fathers miss out on. um, we should not avoid disciplining them when they really need discipline. We need to be a good example, we need to teach them, and we need to be consistent. Don't, of course, be consistently hard or mean. No, we just need to have consistent rules that your children can trust. Being a good parent is the hardest job in the world. In fact, ladies, forgive me, but I think being a good dad is even harder because it doesn't come naturally to us. And Lord knows I have made plenty of mistakes, as my dad before me made mistakes, and his dad before him, and some of those mistakes are exactly the same. Thankfully, although I know some of my dad's mistakes, I still think he was and is a great dad. And that gives me hope as well, that maybe even though I made mistakes and my kids see my mistakes, that that they still think the same of me, that I'm a great dad. And hopefully they won't repeat some of my mistakes as well. But even more importantly, I want God to be able to say, hey, you're a good dad. So, as we've been doing, we're going to finish with some frequently asked questions. First one, this is a tough one. What if my spouse does not support me in my parenting? Yeah, you and your spouse really need to work this out. You need to come to agreement and communicate agreement to your kids. Obviously, you're both different. You will not agree in every single detail, and that's okay. But in general, the general strategy you have toward raising your kids, you should be in agreement with. Remember those sermons about marriage, mutual submission, mutual respect are key. And if you want your spouse to support your parenting, then he or she needs to be in agreement with your strategy and vice versa. It's a two-way street. Number two, what if I'm a single mom? I'm not a dad. I can't be a dad. And all right, I take back what I said about dads having the hardest job. As a single mom, you have the hardest job because you have to be a mom and a dad at once in many ways, and that is never easy. One suggestion is to try to follow this advice for dads here, but also try to find a positive male influence for your child, whether that child's a boy or a girl. Maybe it's someone from your extended family. Maybe it's your father, if that's possible, or your brother. Maybe it's somebody in church. But allow a good man to have a good positive influence in your children's lives. Number three, what if I haven't been a very good, oh, and by the way, that would be the same advice for a single dad. Find a solid woman, especially if you have a girl, but find a solid woman. Maybe it's your sister, maybe it's your mother, maybe it's somebody else from church who can be that positive female influence in your children's lives. So, what if I haven't been a very good dad or parent up until now? Well, it happens. It happens way, way too often, right? But first, ask your children for forgiveness and start over. That would be powerful, and it would demonstrate the attitude that Paul is encouraging here. Now, I know that in many cultures it is just not acceptable for adults to ask children for forgiveness. That's true in large degree here in Poland. I'm guessing that it's true in Taiwanese culture, and many of you are from that culture. However, doing something like that, asking your children for forgiveness, even though it is countercultural, would be even more powerful. Um, I've I suggested this years ago during a parent-teacher conference, that we parents apologize to our kids for something that had happened. Oh, wow. I got a lot of negative feedback about why would we do that? But yet, it's a powerful gesture. Question four. What if my children are already grown and I see the mistakes I made? Yeah, that's where I'm at actually. My children are all grown. I don't have a whole lot of opportunities to fix those mistakes that we made. But again, asking for forgiveness is not a bad idea. I've done that as well with maybe all of my children, but at least I think with the three boys. And it makes a difference. It helps them to understand that you're not perfect. You're trying hard, but you make mistakes. And maybe also it'll help them as parents moving forward. So, um, conversations as well with your adult children are also good, especially if they have children or they're planning to have children. Now, of course, without Christ in their lives, these conversations are much more difficult, but they can still help. You can still instruct your children, although in a different way, so that they can be even better parents than you were. So this is an incredibly tough task. It may be the most important job in the entire world of being a good parent. But by virtue of giving us children, God has entrusted us with this important work. So, in His strength, let us do it as well as we can.